I still remember the strange calm that settled over our family after Grandma Louisa's funeral. Everyone embraced each other, swapped old stories, and talked about how hard she had worked to keep the family close. I wanted to believe every one of those moments was sincere, but something kept nagging at me. It wasn't anything I could point to directly. It was just a feeling that refused to fade. Desmond didn't look like a man who was mourning. Instead, he carried himself with an odd steadiness, almost as if he had already made peace with everything while the rest of us were still struggling to breathe through the loss. During quiet conversations, he kept dropping small comments about how nobody needed to stress over Grandma's flower shop or her savings because it had all been taken care of already. Every single time he said it, he changed the subject before anyone could push further. Nobody else seemed to catch it, but I did. Julian told me I was overanalyzing things and reminded me that grief hits people differently. I wanted to accept that because I trusted my husband and I trusted our family. Still, Desmond's steadiness didn't sit right with me. Grandma Louisa had always been meticulous with her money and her paperwork. She hated leaving loose ends, so it made no sense that nobody around us seemed eager to talk about her final wishes. As the days went by, relatives started mentioning a meeting to sort through the estate, but Desmond kept inventing reasons to push it back. He smiled, offered to help with everything, and kept insisting there was nothing anyone needed to worry about. The calmer he seemed, the more unsettled I became. Somewhere underneath it all, I sensed that whatever he was hiding would eventually reshape how our family saw one another for good. A few days later, the family began discussing a sit-down with the estate lawyer to go over Grandma Louisa's affairs. Everyone agreed the timing made sense, but locking down an actual date turned into an unexpected struggle. Desmond always had a fresh excuse ready. One day he claimed paperwork was still being processed. Another day he insisted the bank hadn't wrapped up its side of things. At first the delays sounded plausible, but after excuse piled on excuse, I started watching more closely. Around that same stretch of time, I noticed something shifting in Julian. Whenever Desmond phoned, Julian would step out of the room before picking up. If I walked in mid-conversation, he wrapped things up fast. He wasn't cold toward me, but he seemed preoccupied, carrying a tension I hadn't seen in him before. One night I asked him directly if something was bothering him. He smiled, told me he was fine, and said I was letting the stress of the funeral get to me. That answer didn't comfort me at all, mostly because he wouldn't hold my gaze while he said it. I brought up Grandma's accounts and the paperwork again, hoping we could work through it together, but he changed the subject almost instantly. That stung more than I expected. Julian had always been transparent with me, and now it felt like a wall had gone up between us. Meanwhile, Desmond kept telling everyone that these things simply took time and that nobody needed to fret. Most of our relatives took his word for it without pushing back. I wanted to believe him too, but every new delay only deepened my doubt. It felt like somebody was stalling for a specific moment, and I couldn't shake the sense that whatever was coming would ripple far beyond Grandma's estate. When the family finally gathered in person to talk things through, I hoped we'd finally get straight answers. Instead, Desmond steered the entire conversation the moment everyone sat down. He reminded us that he had spent the most time caring for Grandma Louisa in her final year, and said we should be grateful instead of questioning him. A few relatives thanked him on the spot and agreed he had earned their trust. Hearing that made it even harder for me to speak up. I calmly asked if we could review the financial records together so everyone could understand what had actually been done. The room went still. Nobody said a word. Then Desmond laughed lightly and said there was no need to complicate things. He claimed the records would be available once the legal process wrapped up. I wasn't trying to accuse anyone of anything. I only wanted the same information everyone else had. Even so, I could feel eyes on me, as though I were the one stirring up trouble. After the gathering, Julian pulled me aside. He asked me to stop pushing so hard because the family had already endured enough pain. He worried another confrontation would tear everyone apart permanently. I understood his fear, but his words left me feeling completely isolated. Grandma Louisa had always told us she wanted every grandchild treated fairly once she was gone. Those words stuck with me, and I couldn't just let them go. If everything had been handled the right way, there would be nothing left to hide. The more people tried to talk me out of asking simple questions, the more convinced I became that something significant was being kept from the rest of us. A week later, the estate lawyer finally called everyone in to begin going through Grandma Louisa's affairs properly. I walked into that meeting hoping the official paperwork would finally clear up everything hanging over our family. At first, it all seemed routine as the lawyer worked through the list of her property and accounts. Then he paused, and his expression shifted. He explained that several savings certificates listed in older estate paperwork were no longer active, and that a significant sum couldn't be traced in the current records. The room went silent. Everyone exchanged glances, trying to make sense of what they'd just heard. Before anyone else could speak, Desmond quickly said the bank must have made an error, or the files were simply out of date. He spoke fast, but I caught his hands trembling as he gathered his papers. The lawyer didn't argue, but he said the missing funds would need to be traced before the estate could move forward. On the drive home, I couldn't hold my questions in any longer. I asked Julian if he knew anything about the missing money. He went quiet for a long stretch before finally telling me something I never expected to hear. Months before Grandma passed, Desmond had mentioned several large withdrawals to him and asked him to keep it quiet, promising everything would make sense eventually. Julian admitted he had trusted his uncle and assumed it was just part of managing Grandma's finances. Hearing that felt like the floor dropped out from under me. I loved my husband, but now he was carrying a secret that could shake the whole family. I didn't know whether to protect our marriage or tell everyone what I just learned. I couldn't just sit around waiting for someone else to uncover the truth. So I asked the lawyer if I could help sort through some of Grandma Louise's personal belongings at her house. He agreed, as long as nothing was removed or altered. While going through boxes in her sewing room, I found a small cedar chest tucked behind an old dress form. Inside were insurance papers, bank summaries, and a worn ledger where Grandma had recorded her finances in her own careful handwriting. As I lined up her notes against the documents we'd already seen, several entries didn't match. The ledger showed money that should still have existed, yet those amounts were nowhere in the current records. I also found a signed form giving Desmond authority to help manage some of Grandma's accounts. Beside one entry, she'd written that he'd offered to take the bookkeeping off her hands because she was tired of dealing with it herself. Reading her words broke something in me. She had trusted him because she believed he was helping her. That evening, I showed Julian everything I'd found. He looked through every page without speaking. Finally, he admitted he had believed Desmond was only using the accounts to cover Grandma's medical bills, her home aid, and other essential costs. He'd never questioned it because he assumed it was all being done for her sake. Watching the realization hit him was its own kind of heartbreak. We both understood the missing money hadn't vanished by accident. Someone had been using Grandma's trust for their own benefit. My sadness slowly hardened into resolve. I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer because every new page made it harder to deny what had actually happened. The lawyer's investigation moved fast once we handed over what we'd found. A few days later, he asked us back because he'd finished tracing the missing withdrawals. What he told us left the whole family stunned. Most of Grandma Louise's cash reserves had already been pulled from her accounts before any of us even knew she had passed. The money had disappeared over the course of several months, leaving only a small remainder behind. There was barely anything left to divide the way she had intended. After the meeting, Julian finally told me the whole story. Desmond had convinced him that if anyone learned about the withdrawals too soon, the family would spend years tearing each other apart, and Grandma's memory would be dragged through it. Julian believed he was protecting everyone by staying silent. Instead, his silence had only bought Desmond more time. When the rest of the family learned how little remained, the room erupted with anger and confusion. Some people blamed Desmond immediately, while others turned on each other. A few relatives even rounded on me and asked why I hadn't spoken up sooner if I'd been so suspicious. Their words cut deep, especially since they dismissed every concern I'd raised earlier. I felt caught between people who wouldn't listen and a husband who had kept the truth from me. That night, Julian and I barely exchanged a word. The trust between us had taken a real hit, and I honestly wasn't sure our marriage could survive everything that had come out. Sitting alone in our living room, I watched the family I loved come apart at the seams, and for the first time, it genuinely felt like Desmond had gotten away with it. After a sleepless night, I realized that confronting Desmond directly would only give him another chance to twist the narrative. If I wanted justice for Grandma Louisa, I needed proof strong enough that nobody could argue with it. I met with the estate lawyer and asked how I could help without stepping on the investigation. He suggested organizing every document chronologically so the full timeline would be unmistakable. I spent hours combing through bank statements, receipts, signed authorizations, and account histories. Slowly, the whole picture came into focus. Every transaction fit into a pattern that showed exactly when the money had moved. We also reached out to people who had spent time with Grandma in her final months. Her longtime neighbor, Mrs. Faraday, remembered Desmond mentioning he was taking full control of the finances because it would be simpler for everyone. A former home health aide recalled hearing conflicting explanations for certain payments. Their memories lined up with the records we'd already gathered. Julian stood by me through every one of those meetings. He stopped defending Desmond and stopped dodging hard conversations. Instead, he apologized again for believing him and promised he'd tell the truth no matter what he was asked. I could see the guilt weighing on him, but I could also see him working to earn my trust back through what he actually did, not just what he said. For the first time in weeks, I stopped feeling powerless. We weren't chasing rumors anymore or guessing at what had happened. We had facts, dates, and witnesses that all pointed the same direction. Desmond had spent months constructing his version of events, but now every piece of evidence was slowly tearing it apart. I knew the next family meeting would look completely different, because this time we were ready for whatever he tried to say. The final estate meeting took place a few days later at the lawyer's office. Everyone arrived hoping it would be the last time we had to sit together and hash out Grandma Louise's affairs. Desmond walked in wearing the same easy smile he'd worn for weeks. He greeted everyone like nothing serious was happening and even joked that we could finally put the whole mess behind us. The lawyer thanked everyone for coming and began walking through the findings. Instead of opening with questions, he started laying documents on the table one after another. There were bank records, signed authorization forms, payment histories, and detailed account summaries. Each page tied another piece of the missing money back to accounts Desmond had controlled. Then the lawyer read through statements from people who had spent time with Grandma near the end. Their memories matched the financial records exactly. As more evidence piled up, the smile slowly slid off Desmond's face. He stopped cutting in and sat quietly, staring at the papers in front of him. Around the table, I watched relatives who had defended him start to understand what had really gone on. Some looked stunned, while others lowered their eyes, realizing they'd trusted the wrong person. Nobody argued with the paperwork, because it all backed itself up. Julian stood beside me without a word, but I could feel him there, steady. For the first time since this whole thing started, Desmond wasn't controlling the room anymore. The truth was doing the talking. The family wasn't buying excuses anymore. They were staring at hard evidence, and every page made it clearer that the story Desmond had told from the very beginning was collapsing right in front of everyone. Once everyone had finished going through the documents, the room fell completely silent. Desmond looked around and realized nobody was speaking up for him anymore. He finally stood and tried to explain himself. First, he claimed people had misread his actions. Then he said he'd been under enormous pressure while caring for Grandma Louisa. Moments later, he shifted his story again and said Julian should have stopped him if he thought something was wrong. It was obvious he was trying to shift the blame onto anyone but himself. The estate lawyer calmly addressed each excuse in turn. He explained that every transfer, payment, and withdrawal had been tracked from start to finish. The records showed the same pattern again and again, and nothing supported Desmond's version of events. There was no ambiguity left in the paperwork. Everything had been thoroughly documented. Julian then stood in front of the family. He admitted he'd made a serious mistake staying quiet for so long. He said he'd trusted the wrong person and accepted full responsibility for his silence. His apology was genuine, and I could see how hard those words were for him to get out. I looked around the room and told everyone that Grandma Louisa deserved to be remembered for the love she poured into her family, not for the lies that followed her passing. I said hiding the truth would never protect her memory. Only honesty could do that. Several relatives nodded in agreement. The anger in the room slowly softened into grief as everyone came to terms with what had really happened. In that moment, the family finally understood who had broken their trust and why everything had unraveled. The legal process dragged on for several more months before everything was finally resolved. The court reviewed the complete financial record and ruled that Desmond had to repay as much of the missing money as possible. He couldn't return all of it since much had already been spent, but the judge made it clear he would be held accountable for what he'd done. After that, the remaining estate was distributed according to Grandma Louisa's written wishes. Every decision was handled openly this time, so no one would ever have reason to question the process again. It didn't erase the pain our family had gone through, but it gave us a real chance to move forward without more secrets hanging over us. Julian and I worked hard to rebuild our marriage after everything. We stopped avoiding the hard conversations and promised each other we'd always choose honesty, even when it was uncomfortable. Trust didn't return overnight, but bit by bit we rebuilt it through what we did, not just what we said. Some relatives stayed close, while others needed more time to heal, and I understood that completely. Looking back, I realized this was never really about the money. It was about the trust Grandma Louisa had placed in the people she loved most. Desmond chose to betray that trust, and in the end, he faced the consequences of his own choices. I still miss my grandmother every single day, but I also carry the values she lived by. She believed that doing the right thing was rarely the easy path, but it was always the right one. In the end, the truth protected her legacy far better than silence ever could have, and that is the lesson our family will carry for the rest of our lives.